All right, good evening, everybody. Move this a little closer. Welcome. Welcome to A History of English Portrait Miniatures told through the Thomson collection with Emma Rutherford. Grateful that you're here with us tonight. I'm Robert Drochet, Richard and Elizabeth Curry, Chief Education and Programming here at the AGO, Métis on my dad's side in French. And so I'm going to open our evening in a good way. I want to acknowledge that the lands where I work, love, play, and create here in Toronto are here and where we're gathered here tonight and where the AGO is hosted on is the lands of the Mississaugas, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. Also want to acknowledge the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We're situated in the Great Lakes region, and that's part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, and that's a nation-to-nation agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. And that agreement is maintains Indigenous sovereignty. It's about taking care of the land, taking care of each other, and making sure people maintain their own language rights and cultural practices. And so, from teachings I've received over the years, we're invited to be here now as long as it's in peaceful ways and, of course, maintaining Indigenous sovereignty. And it's about good relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. I had the pleasure to learn, work, and create alongside the AGO Education Programming Division. And we bring talks like this to people. We engage our youngest visitor to our oldest visitor in informal and formal learning through programs, talks, school down here. If you get a chance, there's courses going on and people are making things. And we have a responsibility, right? So we have a responsibility of enhancing the work that's here so that anyone that walks in feels they belong here and they can understand what it is to engage with art and have conversations. Some of our upcoming programs, we have a talk with Jesse Mockren coming at the end of February. Highly recommend to come see it. The show's great. The show's called Echo, basically one floor above us. Beautiful show. This Friday, for AGO Friday nights, the Canadian Chamber Orchestra will be doing a performance in Walker Court. And then, of course, we offer lovely maker nights and Fridays, and lots of other programming. So I'm going to turn it over to colleague Adam Levine, who is Associate Curator of European Art, who will introduce our guests for the night and get us started.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks, everyone, for joining tonight. I'll echo, Robert was speaking in terms of gratitude and being lucky to work here, and I feel like one of the things that I'm really grateful about my job is that I get to work with the Thomson Collection of European Art, which is a remarkable group of objects. It came with the broader collection of the Thomson collection, which was at its time the largest philanthropic gift in the history of Canada. Absolutely transformed the AGO, and in terms of European art, contains well over 1,000 works of art, and represents in many ways a collection of collections. The late Ken Thomson and his son David collected together and really developed these very specialized, brilliant interests and pursued within these collecting fields the very best of a particular thing. And that includes things like ship models on this level, Chinese snuff bottles, Gothic ivories, 16th century Renaissance boxwoods, and English portrait miniatures, which have been fabulously installed in their kind of wonderful, intimate little case for coming on now 20 years. We're coming up to 20 years of Transformation AGO, which is remarkable because the galleries, to my mind, still look fresh and beautiful and are wonderful places to experience this incredible collection. And so this is the second of a series of talks that I hope will take place a couple per year, basically, that will shed light on a particular collecting area of the Thomson collection. And so when the time came to think about portrait miniatures, Emma Rutherford, our speaker tonight, was really the obvious choice because Emma is a dynamic and brilliant expert in this field. She's based in London, where she runs the Limner Company, and she'll explain tonight that a limner is a name for a portrait miniaturist. she has a master's degree from the University of London, which she completed whilst working at the V&A, which is just casual, managing to do both of those things at once. She established the miniatures department at Phillips Auction House and then went on to work with Bonhams as well, and then completed 15 years working with Philip Mould, who is one of the premier dealers of British portraiture in London, before going out on her own and establishing the Lindner Company, and has presented some truly remarkable discoveries of portrait miniatures since, and has really established a really impressive name for herself and for her company since then. And so I asked her to give us a kind of general history of the medium, the genre of portrait miniatures, but told through the Thomson collection, because we're very lucky to have a collection here with which one can actually do that, tell the kind of long history of this genre. Emma will give her presentation, and then there will be time for questions. Just want to let you know that we are recording. We won't be recording the questions, so ask whatever you'd like. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and thanks Emma ever so much for coming.
Wow. Tall people. Hello, everybody, and thanks so much for coming this evening. My Canadian friend in London said, whatever you do, just don't mention the weather, because everyone's so bored of it. But I can tell you that if this was London and that was the weather outside, everyone would be in watching EastEnders. Nobody would be here listening to me speak, so I really appreciate it. But so yeah, as Adam says, thank you for the lovely introduction. It's my great privilege to be talking to you tonight about the Thomson collection. I knew Lord Thomson, or Ken, as he insisted everyone called him after about 30 seconds of meeting him. And I watched with absolute awe as a sort of 20-something research assistant in an auction house as he grew this incredible collection of portrait miniatures, some of which he'd already bought, but many of which I sort of saw come onto the art market and found incredibly exciting. And it's just amazing to be here, thousands of miles away from London, talking about them. His son David, who's now obviously also a notable collector, said, "My father held objects in his hand. He craved the intimacy." And I really hope that tonight I'm going to give you a talk not just about portrait miniatures, but why this art form really, really got to Ken, and why it just held such allure for him. So let's get going. So I don't know if we can have the lights down a little bit at the back, maybe not, so you can see these images, because one thing I want you to kind of keep in mind, and one of the reasons I've worn this fancy brooch is because most of the things you're going to see on the screen are about the size of this brooch or smaller. And this is one of the great things about giving a talk, is that I can show you things that normally you could only see through a magnifying glass. So just bear that in mind, and I won't keep reminding you. I'm also going to remind you about this amazing book written by a colleague and friend of mine, Sue Sloman, which you can buy online, about the collection. So if you are interested in what I'm talking about tonight, Sue really delves a lot deeper than I'm going to be able to. And I'm going to tell the story of portrait miniatures. I can't use all of Ken's collection, but we will get there fairly quickly. But I'm going to start with these two images, just to really give you an idea about exactly what a portrait miniature was when it was first born. They don't really start being painted until the early 1520s. And the reason I've put these two slides up is because you can see on the left, this is a leaf or part of a illuminated manuscript. You've got Henry VIII in his gold H, but painted in a circular format. And then by the side of it, you have this image of him, which is almost identical. He's almost wearing exactly the same clothing, but it's come out of the manuscript. It's emancipated from the manuscript, and it's enclosed in a gold frame. But they're about the same size. And this is a really great illustration of the fact that portrait miniatures evolve from manuscript illumination. So contrary to popular opinion, they're not just sort of shrunk down oil paintings. They have a real specific history of how they evolved. And the reason, as Adam said, they were called limnings and the people who painted them were called limners was because they came from the manuscript illumination, and the word limner and to lim came from illuminata, which means to give light, which I think is a really, really beautiful way of describing these sort of jewel-like small pictures. Sorry, something fancy's happened to my slides. So I put this one in just as an extra. This is Henry in his 35th year, and you can see he doesn't have a beard. So the other really, really wonderful thing about miniatures is that they really, even in the really earliest form, capture a moment in somebody's life. And there are very, very few portraits of Henry without a beard, because in a sort of, boys' club moment, when he met Francis I of France at the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, and Francis had a beard, Henry decided he needed a beard too. So here he doesn't have one, but he's on his way to matching Francis's fine beard. But you can also see in this miniature just sort of the remnants of the illuminated manuscript around it, this lovely red, which is a reminder that the word miniature, which was used in the 16th century to describe these small portraits, came from the word minium, which was a red lead paint used specifically in manuscript illumination. So minium, miniature, limning, limner, they're sort of evolving into their own thing and separate from the manuscript. Somebody writes, with courage and a pair of scissors, if you're given a manuscript, you could make the first portrait miniature. I don't recommend it, but you can sort of see what they mean. They've literally cut around and taken the portrait out of the manuscript. And this is a fantastic portrait miniature that is in the V&A in London. And it shows Simon Benning, who was a manuscript illuminator. And in fact, Adam told me today that you have an amazing illuminated manuscript leaf by Simon Benning. But one of the reasons I wanted to show you this, just to keep you in mind of that idea that miniatures are evolving from the manuscript page, but also because you can see how he's painting. He's actually painting a leaf of a virgin and child here, but he could easily be painting a miniature because he's working on this slope. He has his north-facing light, and most excitingly, he's got a pair of spectacles in his hand. And one of the most frequent questions I'm asked is, did miniaturists use any magnifying glasses? And I think you have your answer here. In the 16th century, they were available. But probably, as hopefully I'll remember to tell you later on, the art of manuscript, the art of limning or painting miniatures was quite a sort of secretive art. Nobody was really quite sure how these artists produced these incredible small portraits. But here, Benning has got his spectacles in his hand. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how they were painted, because as well as being very specifically linked to the illuminated manuscript, they were also painted in a very, very specific way. And most miniaturists had a very long apprenticeship and training. This is an amazing unfinished portrait of Elizabeth I, and it's amazing because she looks old. She actually looks as though she's left her teeth out. She's clearly wearing a wig. It's not really matching the eyebrows or lack thereof. And it's no wonder that Oliver, who was he never painted her again. Basically, he was possibly lucky to keep his head, but I think this really gives you a glimpse into just how really realistic portrait miniatures were, and how they tried to really capture the features of the person in front of the artist. And one of the first rules of painting miniatures was you had the person in front of you. So Hilliard, who we're going to talk about shortly, he recalls the first time that Elizabeth I sat to him, and she wanted to sit in a garden because she didn't want harsh shadows on her face. I think she was sort of 37 or something like that, but clearly was feeling slightly older that day. But this is just such a good example, not only of miniaturist techniques, but just how this is what Elizabeth I really looked like. Forget the big oil paintings. So here you can see, hopefully, that there's a slightly different colour on Elizabeth's face to the rest of her. And the artist would start off by choosing something called a carnation, which he just put on fairly lightly and tried to match the sitter's complexion. And then most of that would be sort of wiped away around the face as they just filled in some of the details. And then you can see on the other image, let's attempt a pointer. So this is vellum, which was usually goat skin, very fine. It was stretched and smoothed, and really made as fine as possible for an artist to paint on. But if you've ever held something like kid gloves or leather, or very, very fine leather, is floppy, so they needed something to put this vellum onto. And the best thing that was available were playing cards, because everybody played cards. It didn't matter if you were a farmer or a nobleman, you played cards, and these cards had to be sturdy. They were used every day, and they were just incredibly good for pasting the vellum onto as a support. The other side of this playing card would be plain. No advertising from British Airways at this date, so they could paste the vellum onto the other side, and the thing they used to smooth it down with was this stick that was mounted with a tooth. I've put beaver's tooth there, stoat, dog. I sort of imagine all these toothless Elizabethan animals running around. You sort of hope they'd deceased before they removed the tooth. But the tooth was used to just burnish that vellum down, so you get this lovely smooth surface on which to paint. And then this azurite or aquamarine, which was a really difficult paint to work with, was sort of floated in around the side. And then you can see here Oliver's left a border that would have been filled in with gold, but it's cut down into an oval from this original rectangular piece of card. Sorry, not quite onto the Thomson collection yet, but I wanted to show you this for when we look at other miniatures by Hilliard, who was the first English artist to have a really successful career as a miniaturist. And he really became the person who Elizabeth I trusted to produce a really fantastic image of her. But just to point out some things here with just how specifically portrait miniatures were painted. All of this, these dots around her neck that now look like frog spawn, they actually had silver highlights on them. So all of this in the middle of these stars would have been silver, but silver tarnishes incredibly quickly. She's even got a fabulous crossbow jewel in her hair up there, but it tarnished usually within the artist's lifetime. In fact, they used to try and rub it with garlic to try and get the sheen back, which didn't work. Just made them smell awful. But you can see as well. I mean, you have to remember we're talking about something that is smaller than my brooch, and look at all this incredible detail, all the embroidery, every stitch, and then this is taken in raking light, so you can also see not only this discoloration of the silver that would have given pearls their highlight, but also can you see how three-dimensional this ruff is? I mean, it's casting a shadow, and if you were to run your hand over this ruff, it would feel like a doily, it would feel three-dimensional, but it's so, I mean, you're looking at, millimeters here of painting, and he's got this incredible, he's followed the line of the ruff, and then these lovely naturalistic touches of her hair just falling over the ruff there, just to remind you that the face you're looking into is a human being who was sitting in front of the artist always. Yes, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the way or what miniatures were really used for in their first incarnation. So here you have the famous Hans Holbein of Anne of Cleves, and the reason I've put this one next to it, this is her sister, and we know that Henry VIII sent Holbein to Cleves to paint Anne, and he sent Holbein and he sent him to specifically do a miniature. He did do an oil painting as well, but the miniature came back first. And this is because not only was Holbein going to paint a really realistic portrait of Anne, and Henry really wanted to know what she looked like, but also watercolour dries incredibly quickly. Oil painting can take months to dry. This could have been painted and packed up and sent back to the king really, really fast, which was really important. But also, I just wanted to show really how delicate and brilliant miniatures were. I think if Holbein had made Anne of Cleves look more like this, the marriage might not have gone ahead. But yeah, it's. I mean, there's just such brilliance in miniature painting at this date, and you can see she's in this probably original ivory turned box, which still has. You can still screw this lid on to protect it, because you might have had a rock crystal glass, but it's quite unlikely. So this would have been the protection. So miniatures were used not only for sort of love purposes, but obviously this is a sort of mixture of love and diplomacy that this image is being used for. And poor Oliver Cromwell, who organised this marriage, as we know, got into a lot of trouble. And when Henry VIII met Anne, famously, it was not love at first sight. He said she is nothing fair and have very evil smells about her, which obviously he couldn't tell from the miniature. It was a disaster. But interestingly, Holbein wasn't blamed at all. You know, he did his job there and brought Anne back before Henry made his decision. Apparently, Christina of Denmark, who was also in the running for the job of next wife, said if I had two heads, I might have considered it, but no, thank you. Yeah. So we're going to finally see one of your wonderful miniatures here. And you can see that this miniature's also survived in its original box. This is a black stained ivory box with that. I can't remember if that's the lid, although I think that's the back. But it's got this lovely carving on it that is original to the miniature. And you might notice it's looking rather odd at this angle, but circular. So this miniature is circular. because it's such an early miniature by Hilliard that you have here. So 1574 is the date. He painted Elizabeth I for the first time just 2 years earlier, which really launched Hilliard's career. And of course, there were queues then of people wanting to look like the Queen. So you get a lot of auburn wigs worn by ladies, but just look at the incredible detail here, and again, same size as my brooch, this one, or slightly smaller, and also this fabulous calligraphy. I should say Hilliard was trained as a goldsmith, and the way that he painted jewels was just amazing. He would lay down a layer of shell silver, and it was called shell silver because artists used mussel shells to keep the paint in. If you're painting something this size, you don't need a big palette. So mussel shells, and everybody ate mussels, so the shells were plentiful, with just the perfect size to hold the paint that you wanted. But Hilliard used real ground silver and real ground gold for his jewels. So the lady Boughton here, who's wearing this gold chain, that's painted in real gold. And then he would, for things like rubies, he would melt some resin, take a pin, and then put a pin top of resin, red resin, on top of the shell gold. So a little bit like when you mount a real stone, you used to back it with silver to sort of give it extra luminosity, and then he would put the gold setting around it. So even though you're talking about jewels that are the size of a pinhead, the care that's been taken is just astonishing. It's have a very close look next time. But Nicholas Hilliard, although he was an astonishingly amazing painter and very in favour with Elizabeth, he was always broke, and he just had the most disastrous run with money. He was scammed into believing there was a gold mine in Scotland and handed over a fortune, only to get zero back. So it meant, rather amazingly, that he took commissions basically from anybody who could afford him. So incredibly, we get portraits like this of a merchant's wife, probably wearing her very, very best clothing, but not a single jewel, just this wonderful black here, which Hilliard would have painted all these different tones by burning different types of pip or bone to create different shades of black, and then mixing with some gum arabic for the detail, so to thicken it up. But it's an incredibly ambitious portrait, this. Notice the beautiful hands. Miniaturists who come later, you won't see any hands. Miniaturists are terrible at hands because they're really focusing on the face. So, but Hilliard's hands, beautiful. But I'm just going to go back one. So I mentioned that this one was circular. So this is painted so early that it's just before Hilliard's very formative trip to France, where he saw Francois Clouet's miniatures, which were all oval. And because most miniaturists are painting head and bust, really, the oval was thought to be much more flattering and a sensible shape. So he's moving from the circular. This is very unusual in being rectangular, but on the whole, he's painting in oval. So this is an amazing miniature by his son, Lawrence. So poor Lawrence, he didn't have much luck as an artist. This is probably his masterpiece. And you'll notice the spelling of the name. He was named after his mother, So he's sort of landed with a woman's name, but he just never took off in the same way as his father. And there are really extraordinary stories about Lawrence, including he paid a group of thugs to beat him up to so that he could avoid painting. I mean, really, talk about extremes. But this is just amazing, and probably is his best work. But can you see it's painted? It's painted quite late, 1621, and by this date, really, this blue background starts to become really old. It's becoming old-fashioned, and we're moving on to. As you'll see, very, very different looking miniatures. But one amazing thing about this miniature is the case, which is more or less completely original. So it's a fantastic example of the fact that you would close this case down, this locket, and it was one of the ways in which you could wear your lover. I'm not saying this chap was anyone's lover, maybe he was, but you could wear someone really secretly who you were in love with, and there are lots of fantastic anecdotes about this. So the next slide, if I can get it to work, is a very short demonstration of how miniatures were worn when they were originally kept in these lockets. You quite often see oil paintings of women with a black silk cord around their neck, and it's sometimes tied in a little bow, and it disappears under their bodice. And I'll show you what is probably on the other side of it. It's a miniature. But it's just one of the ways in which women had a little bit of agency at this time, in that they could wear secretly somebody who they were in love with, who perhaps wasn't approved by Elizabeth. And there's a fantastic anecdote of I think it was Burghley's niece came into court wearing a miniature, and Elizabeth just didn't approve. So she took this miniature off of this poor girl and pinned it to her shoe, so the lowest place on her body, and walked about court with this miniature banging on her shoe all day. And then the next day, I think there were some sonnets written by the young man in the miniature, and by day 3, it had come up her body and was pinned on her elbow, and then eventually by day 4, the sonnets were obviously so over the top that Elizabeth came in to court wearing the miniature over her heart. So they're the only work of art, the only portrait that's sort of moved around the body and can be worn secretly like this. So it does make them very, very exciting and intimate works of art. And just to really hammer the point home, this amazing miniature in the V&A probably doesn't take too much explanation. This is a young man set against a burning wall of flames to stand in for his passion. He is, I mean, he's sort of virtually naked in Elizabethan eyes. He's wearing a shirt that he would only wear in the privacy of his bedchamber. This would always be covered by an outer garment in public. And then around his neck, we're not 100% sure, but we're pretty convinced that this is a portrait miniature. But of course, he's never going to turn it over for us, so we'll never know who's on the other side. But even this background here has got shell gold. So if you also think about portrait miniatures being looked at in candlelight, something like this would have absolutely shimmered, and perhaps his secret lady love in that miniature there could only look at this in candlelight and see those shimmering flames. But it's just such a fantastic example that portrait miniatures are the sort of sexiest form of portraiture. It's not just me. So Isaac Oliver was the artist who followed Nicholas Hilliard, and he supported Nicholas Hilliard. He was definitely in Hilliard's studio, and he probably assisted Hilliard rather than necessarily learning from him. And he appears on the scene really just as James is coming to the throne, and there's this separate court of Anne of Denmark and her young teenage son, Henry, who sadly dies at 18. But they established this separate court, which is the sort of party court. I did once write a blog post called "Party Like It's 1599" because they really went for it in terms of masks, and masks were the ultimate party. There was fireworks and music and drinking, and women in particular were encouraged to wear incredibly risque outfits. Sometimes they would even have their breasts exposed, and these took place in noble houses. So it was a sort of like a raucous house party for the nobility. But what's wonderful is that a lot of these costumes are captured in miniature, because often the images are slightly too risque to have put into an oil painting. So this lady, Mrs. Cam of Newport, which makes her sound very staid, has got this fabulous sort of wired headdress, which is pretty wild. And then this fantastic gown as well, all embroidered with all these different emblems, and she's got all her jewels on, which was very mask of her, but again, she's in a beautiful frame. Isn't that amazing? And it matches the sort of tones of the portrait as well. So Oliver really comes onto the scene and takes over from Hilliard in terms of the Queen's Court, which is thought to be much more sort of forward-thinking, a lot more interest in European art. And poor Hilliard is stuck with James, who proves to be a rather uninspiring subject after the joy of Elizabeth. I think I did have a quote about James, but it's not particularly flattering. Yes, he was described. So the best thing I could find about him: in the whole man, not uncomely. So yeah, no one's going any further than that. But one reason for keeping Hilliard on was to sort of establish that James was going to follow Elizabeth in terms of the wonderful stability that she brought to the country, and in keeping Hilliard on for James's miniatures, which of course would be sent out to different ambassadors and countries, it kind of really helped anchor that continuity. So these were incredibly important for James. So I'm sorry, we're in the unattractive men section of the talk, but and I've skipped forward around half a century here, just because obviously we haven't quite got the time to cover hundreds of years. But miniatures really came on apace, as did most forms of portraiture, after Anthony van Dyck came to the English court, and really introduced this sort of much more realistic, relaxed, painterly type of portraiture, and that was reflected just as much in the portrait miniatures that were produced at the time, and particularly by Samuel Cooper. So the one in the Thomson collection is the one on the right here, and you can see how the expression warts and all has come from this miniature of Cromwell. I curated an exhibition on Cooper, and one critic who came to the exhibition said something like, if you want to see the best painted wart in history, you need to get yourself down to Pall Mall. And but I mean, it is true that it was Cooper who was instructed by Cromwell to paint him warts and all. And Lely, who copied this miniature into an oil painting, the quote's often attributed to him, but it was actually said to Samuel Cooper. So it's quite an unusual reversal in that the painting was copied from the miniature. But there was in the mid 17th century, there's also a huge desire for this immediacy that portrait miniatures could give. So the fact that this miniature is unfinished is partially so that Cooper could paint other finished versions of it, but it was also thought to be that there was sort of something of the magic. It sort of broke down the barrier between painting and subject when something was left unfinished. But it's really helpful to have this one from the Thomson collection as well, because you can see just how realistic and unflattering Cooper was as a miniaturist. I love to think about him faced with Cromwell's daughters, who were not blessed with these are the genes. And he was commissioned to paint them. But interestingly, this is a period. Obviously, Charles I has been executed in 1649, and we're in the interregnum, the Puritan period, where a lot of miniatures are being painted because there's a lot of movement and discord between families, and they dry quickly. They're still being painted on vellum, and they can be moved around very, very easily. So they're incredibly useful works of art. Just as an aside, Cromwell did have this miniature made into two finished versions which survive. I think there were probably more. And the one he sent to the Swedish ambassador, he had set with diamonds that today would cost around $300,000. I did do the conversion. So he's sort of, yes, warts and all, but please, but a bit of bling, and maybe the bling slightly put people off looking too closely at the warts, but we'll never know. Back to men in shirts. I just couldn't not put this amazing miniature in. So this is painted by Samuel Cooper's brother Alexander, who spent a lot of time on the continent, whereas Samuel Cooper stayed in England for his career. But isn't it amazing? I mean, so one of the really interesting things is his pearl earring. Honestly, not this bit up here, ladies. The three pearls are incredibly unusual. That we haven't really found this sort of configuration in many other portraits, but pearls are obviously associated with Venus and love. So there's absolutely no doubt that this portrait was intended to be handed over to a lover, and this is why miniatures are so exciting. So moving on to the restoration, and the Restoration Court again brought with it a whole new requirement for portraiture. This is the sort of the jolly court of Charles II, and every single mistress was painted in miniature, as you can imagine. But you can see here how the artist Richard Gibson has used all the sort of richness of oil painting. So there's a lot more gum arabic being mixed in with the watercolor, and they're slightly less flat than those early Hilliards that we've been looking at that almost look more like tapestry. And I just wanted to focus very briefly on Richard Gibson, because it wasn't just how well you could paint. There was also quite a big interest always in the artists of these miniatures. And Richard Gibson was a dwarf. this is probably him painted by his friend Peter Lely. And he was an astonishing painter, but I think he could paint in oil, but he potentially chose to paint in miniature because he realized he would get more business by being a small man painting small art. But he was just incredible, and lived around the corner from Peter Lely, and they shared clients. So a lot of artists gathered around Covent Garden at this sort of date. But there was quite an interest, as there perhaps wasn't so much in oil painters, in the miniaturists themselves, which we'll see in the 18th century as well. So I'm really moving on here. And moving into the 18th century, I just wanted to show you something revolutionary that happened with portrait miniatures. And I'm hoping you can perhaps see in these slides that this miniature here is painted on vellum. This is by Van der Dort, that's in the Thomson collection. And then this miniature by Rosalba Carriera, half a century later, is painted on ivory. And as is this one by Bernard Lenz, and then this final one by Richard Cosway, or attributed to Richard Cosway. And ivory is quite a strange choice, moving from vellum, because whilst vellum is very sympathetic to watercolour, ivory is quite slippery and greasy and really, really difficult to work with, but particularly with watercolour, it just slides straight off. So the preparation of ivory took a lot of work. It was pockmarked, again, with poor animals' teeth, in order for the paint to sort of sit in little pits. It was ironed between sheets of cambric to try and draw the oil out with vinegar, and it was a really, really difficult material to get the paint to sit on. So it was a really, really strange choice. And you can see, the reason I put this one up by Bernard Lenz, can you see the little stipples that the artist has used? These really, really short strokes helped to get the paint to adhere to the surface. And then Richard Cosway, by the time he's painting, so much later, 70 years later, he is being able to use the ivory. There's some bare ivory here in order to kind of really show those sort of skin tones. And he's using a much more watery paint, just like Rosalba Carriera, who's the sort of first artist to produce miniatures on ivory over in Venice, is doing. So this is a new thing that's happening in the 18th century. I was at Yale, I don't even know what day of the week it is, Monday. I was at Yale, and they had this artist's box, and I just thought this is such a great opportunity to show you. So there's the mussel shells. These are slightly bigger shells that they've used, and this is a squirrel hair brush. One of the other questions I get asked is, did miniaturists use a single hair brush? Well, no, because that wouldn't hold any paint. But these squirrel hair brushes were very fine, and they came down more or less to a single hair. And then the case here, the travelling case for the miniaturist, meant that they could travel. They could go to places in England like Bath, where people were for the season, and they could take all their equipment with them, and it really didn't take up much space, unlike moving an entire studio for an oil painter. The other thing that happened in the 18th century was that the backs of miniatures became really important. So here you've got two really lovely examples in the Thomson collection of hair on the back. People either go, ooh, or wow, with hair on the back. And it can be a bit creepy, especially when it's just sort of tied like this as a lock. This is a bit more fancy and probably done by a hairwork person. But one point I wanted to make is one of the reasons why hair is on the back of portrait miniatures in the 18th century. You can see these sitters have powdered hair, and when you were introduced to your future husband or wife, which is the sort of prime point for having your portrait miniature painted, you might not know, because you're meeting in a very formal setting with a chaperone and you've got your hair's powdered. You might not know what the actual colour hair is of your future spouse. Sorry, I've married these two up here, but they're not actually married. So it was a sort of extra piece of information in the back at that point of engagement. And hair doesn't age; it doesn't change. So it's also to do with the fact that miniatures were kept and forever, in terms of they sort of meant that person was with you in body and spirit, and the hair really, really helped with that sort of idea of sentimentality. This is also an amazing miniature, and it helps me make the point about miniaturists in the 18th century, because the Royal Academy opens in 1768, and there's a sort of assessment of what is the most important type of painting, and history painting goes right to the top of the ladder, and portraiture sinks right to the bottom, and underneath portraiture in general are miniatures. And there's a miniaturist called Ozias Humphrey who describes the disgrace of miniature painting. He is almost ashamed to be a miniature painter at this sort of date. And I found it really interesting that William Pether, who's known as a miniaturist, in his self-portrait, he's not painting a miniature, he's painting something much more, or drawing something much more grand, and not alluding to the fact that his sort of stock in trade is actually painting miniatures. So at this point, it's sort of interesting to see miniatures as something that were very needed by people. There's no photography, so they're sort of almost become a part craft, part art. But they're definitely not considered high art in any way, unless you're Richard Cosway, in which case you consider yourself absolutely at the very top of the tree. So you've got some lovely examples in the Thomson collection, which I'll show you here, by Richard Cosway. But again, just thinking about the personality of the artists, Cosway was just extraordinary. He was just under 5 foot high. So again, we've got a small man painting small pictures. But he wore incredibly high heels, and as you can see here, he liked to put a height on his head as well. He was described sort of flouncing into the Royal Academy once with a coat profusely embroidered with strawberries, and sporting a sword as well. So he was really, really proud of his appearance, but unfortunately that led to great ridicule. And he was known as a macaroni, which was almost the worst thing you could be at the time, because it meant you spent half your day putting your makeup on, and the other half just sort of going to parties. But people were very interested with Cosway because he was right at the centre of the action. He was actually really, really good friends with the Prince of Wales. He was responsible for painting all of the prince's mistresses, and particularly Maria Fitzherbert. And when Fitzherbert and George IV, as Prince Regent, were separated, he even painted just the eye of the prince to send to Maria, to remind her that this lovesick prince was waiting for her back in London. But that is a beautiful miniature in the collection by Cosway. And just to remember how difficult the ivory is to paint on, you can just see Cosway's really confident technique here. It's just just astonishing. And you can also see, this is a lovely example of his signature on the back here, which probably took him about as long as it did to do this bit, because he puts his full title, which the Prince of Wales gave him, to elevate him, and his RA there, he was a Royal Academician as well. And then Cosway's great sort of not really rival, because they were painting such different sort of sections of society, but the other person working at this time, who'd graduated from Shipley School at the same year as Richard Cosway, is an artist called John Smart. And I try to get this one a little bit bigger so you can sort of appreciate Smart's preciseness compared to Cosway's sort of much more painterly, sorry, I realise I've been talking all this way, much more painterly technique. Smart's, I mean, you did not want to sit to Smart if you were perhaps over the age of 30, because he painted every single line on your face. He's absolutely meticulous. What's interesting here also is that he spent 10 years in India. And I always think you can tell an Indian Smart without even looking at the date. Look how sweaty he is. You see that sheen of sweat. It's just amazing. And it's just so vivid, and as though you're there. The English weren't very good at adapting their clothing to the Indian climate. They just wore the same thing. And it was, so they always look very hot. But yeah, John Smart's incredible. I did have a good quote. Oh, yes. So he was a very hard worker, but not particularly well liked. And he once wrote, "Dear me, sir, I can sit on my arse for 18 hours together without stirring and put 24 guineas in my pocket at a sitting." So it's sort of a good example of how miniatures were so sought after and how much money you could make from them, but also how they weren't really thought of as particularly sort of highly regarded works of art. Oh yes, I saw this at Yale as well. So this is somebody who has just arrived from England to India, and the first thing this poor chap's doing is, well, not so poor, is having his portrait painted, which is why Smart goes out to India for a decade, because he thinks, so many people travelling backwards and forwards with the East India Company. He can make so much money by these people coming in and out, and sending miniatures back to England. So I thought that was a really nice example of that. And here's another John Smart. I won't call her sweaty because that seems a bit unfair. Glowing, that's it. This glowing lady, 1786. So this is the year after he arrives in Madras. And he paints not only the English population out there, the expats, but he also paints people who were ruling India at the time, and everybody sits to Smart. But I thought we'd go perhaps from one brilliant artist to one who perhaps wasn't quite so good. So Andrew Plimer. Someone wrote in the early 20th century, his ladies have a peculiar combination of equine with gypsy good looks. I don't think that's a comment post Me Too you can get away with. But Andrew Plimer, who painted these, he was actually a sort of servant to Richard Cosway, who realised that he had some talent and allowed him to help him mix paints. And then Plimer goes off and has a career. But really, you can tell he's just getting people through the door as quickly as possible. And there's been some thought that he just had the same dress and then he just stuck different heads on it. And when I curated an exhibition at a house called Compton Verney last year, we had these 4 men who we ended up calling the boy band, but they just looked identical. But we had the names of, they were genuinely all different sitters, but it's just an example of the different levels of miniature painting which were available at the time, and it depended how much you could afford. If you could afford Cosway, great, but Plimer would do just as well, but was an awful lot cheaper. And these two, well, I'm sort of indulging myself a bit here because they are two of my favourites in the Thomson collection, but they're also a good example of the different, of how miniature paintings really spread out from the court and the very wealthy, and beginning to mark occasions, sort of, this is your sort of graduation ceremony photograph, more or less, but in miniature. And a lot of children get painted as well, which it is quite interesting because obviously the mortality rate's very high, but there was something about painting your child or having your child recorded in a miniature that was sort of thought okay, in really in line with miniatures feeling perhaps slightly more ephemeral, but these two are particularly beautiful examples in the Thomson collection. And then I thought I'd sort of end really with what happened to miniatures, which is obviously photography, because miniatures all along really had parallels with photography. They were quick to paint, quick to dry. They captured a moment. One interesting thing is, I don't know if you noticed, the chap in the John Smart miniature had slightly sort of purpley hair. That's not an accident or a paint discoloration. You could actually buy coloured powders for your hair, but you never ever see that in an oil portrait because it was obviously thought to be it was going to go out of fashion so quickly. If you wanted to look cool, fine for a miniature, but you just wouldn't commission an oil portrait with something that was a trend that was going to pass so quickly. So photography, when it came along, was bound to have a massive impact on portrait miniatures. But you can see the dates under these. You might be interested to see the progression almost that I've put here. So Queen Victoria and Albert in particular were huge fans of photography when it first began, having been huge fans of portrait miniatures and exchanged portrait miniatures regularly, particularly at Christmas, their growing children, or their growing family rather. But when photography came along, they just found it so exciting, and you get these fantastic candid early photographs of Albert and Victoria, and then in the middle there's this kind of weird hybrid. So people didn't like the fact that they were going from these wonderfully coloured portrait miniatures to something that had no colour in it. So a lot of the miniaturists who were still painting were actually employed in photographic studios to colour in sepia photographs to make them look like miniatures, which seems a really odd thing to do, but that's what happened. But then there was a sort of, towards the end of the century, you get a sort of revival in miniatures, and particularly the Edwardian period. There's a sort of renewed interest and a nostalgia for. And I chose this particularly pretty one from the Royal Collection because you can sort of see how wonderfully sort of soft and romantic and flattering a miniature could be, really, as opposed to the sort of veracity of a photograph. And yes, so this was the final exhibit in my exhibition at Compton Verney because I think this is an incredibly helpful way to think about portrait miniatures. Today's version of a portrait miniature is your iPhone, because it's something where you choose who sees the image on your phone. It's usually somebody or a pet or something you want to look at every time you use this object. And if you think about the number of times that you use your phone, it's probably similar to the number of times people looked at their miniature on their wrist or around their neck. So I think, and the scale is also incredibly similar to a portrait miniature. So I sort of realised I've raced through 500 years of history here, but I kind of hope next time you're in the gallery with the miniatures, you might imagine turning them over, holding them in your hand, and imagining the emotions of a lovesick teenager, or a newly promoted army officer, a grieving mother, and appreciate that these tiny portraits really do, well, for me in particular, dissolve the time between past and present in a way that I don't think any other art form can. Thank you so much.